The rain poured heavily that evening, drenching the city streets in a cold, relentless downpour. People hurried past, shielding themselves with umbrellas and rushing to their destinations. But one little girl remained where she was, alone, huddled, under the awning of a closed bakery, watching the world move around her. Her clothes were worn, her shoes barely held together, and in her small hands, she clutched a piece of stale bread, nibbling on it slowly to make it last. She had no family, no home, no warm bed to crawl into at night. For as long as she could, remember, she had been just another forgotten child in the foster system, shuffled from one place to another, never truly belonging anywhere. But she had learned something important in her short life. People who said they cared didn't always mean it. Some foster homes were kind, some weren't. Some people smiled at her. Others looked right through her. And then there were the ones who only saw her as a problem, an inconvenience. She had met all kinds. So when the social worker showed up at her temporary shelter that morning, all bright smiles and excitement, telling her a wealthy man was interested in adopting her, she didn't know how to feel. A millionaire? She had never met a millionaire before. Why would someone like that want a child like her? People with money only adopted babies or kids who looked perfect in front of cameras. Not someone like her, a 10-year-old girl with a past nobody wanted to hear about. The social worker insisted. Just spend a day with him, she said. Get to know him. Maybe you'll like him. That's how she found herself in a big black car with tinted windows, heading towards a mansion that looked too grand, too polished, too far from anything she had ever known. And when she arrived, it was even worse. Marble floors, gold-trimmed furniture, a chandelier bigger than her entire old bedroom. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum where she wasn't allowed to touch anything. Then there was him, the man who wanted to adopt her, Nathan Carter. Tall, well-dressed, with sharp blue eyes that studied her closely, as if trying to understand her. He was polite, nice even, but something about him made her uneasy. Not because he was cruel. He wasn't. Not because he was impatient. He wasn't. He just felt different, like he lived in a world so far from hers that they could never really understand each other. He tried. He showed her around the house, introduced her to the staff, even asked what kind of food she liked so the chef could prepare it. She barely answered. She didn't want fancy meals. She didn't want golden staircases or silk curtains. She wanted warmth, laughter, a place where she felt safe. But the moment that changed everything came later in the evening. Nathan had taken her to his home office, a large room filled with books, paintings, and awards. He sat across from her, hands folded, speaking gently. "I know this is all new to you," he said, "and I don't expect you to feel at home right away. But if you give it a chance, I'd really like to be your father." His words should have made her happy. A real home, a real dad. She had dreamed of that once, but instead of feeling joy, she felt a tight knot in her chest. Something wasn't right. Then she saw it, on his desk, a framed photo of a little boy, blonde hair, blue eyes, just like Nathan, a child who belonged in this world. Her stomach twisted. She looked at Nathan. "Who is that?" For the first time, his expression faltered. "That's my son," he said quietly. "He passed away 2 years ago." Everything clicked. The perfect house, the perfect manners, the perfect act. He didn't want her because of who she was. He wanted her because of who she reminded him of. A replacement? She stood up, shaking her head. "I don't want this." Nathan looked confused. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "I don't want to be adopted by you. His eyes widened slightly, stunned by her words. No one had ever turned down a life of wealth and comfort. No one had ever looked him in the eye and said no. Why? He asked, his voice quieter now. She hesitated, feeling a lump in her throat. How could she explain? How could she make him understand that money wasn't what made a family, that love couldn't be bought, that she had spent her whole life being someone else's burden, and she wouldn't let herself become someone else's replacement? She turned away before the tears could come. I just can't, she whispered, and with that, she walked out of the room, leaving Nathan Carter frozen in place, shocked, confused, and for the first time in years, completely lost for words. Nathan Carter sat in his chair, staring at the empty doorway where the little girl had just walked out. He had expected her to be quiet, maybe even distant, but he had never imagined she would reject him outright. It didn't make sense. He had offered her a life most people could only dream of. A warm home, security, a future filled with possibilities, but she didn't want any of it. His thoughts were interrupted when the social worker entered the office, a look of concern on her face. She's in the guest room, she said gently. She asked if she could stay there for the night. I thought it might be best to give her space. Nathan nodded, rubbing his temple. Did she say anything? The woman hesitated before speaking. Just that she didn't belong here. The words hit him harder than they should have. He let out a sigh and leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. He had thought this would be simple. He had the means to provide a child with a good life, and he truly wanted to. After losing his son, his world had become empty. The halls of his mansion echoed with silence. No laughter, no footsteps running down the halls, no late-night stories before bed. He had convinced himself that adopting a child would fix that void in his heart, but he had been wrong. She wasn't his son. She never would be, and she knew it that night. As the storm continued outside, Nathan found himself standing outside the guest room door, hesitating. Finally, he knocked lightly. There was a long pause before the door creaked open, just enough for her small face to appear. Her eyes were tired, guarded. Nathan swallowed. "Can we talk?" She didn't answer, but she stepped back, letting the door open fully. He took that as a yes. The room was large, elegant, yet untouched. She sat on the edge of the bed, her tiny hands gripping the blanket, as if unsure whether she was even allowed to be there. Nathan took a deep breath and sat on the chair across from her. "I know you don't want to be here," he started carefully, "but I just need to understand why." She looked down, kicking her legs slightly, as if gathering her thoughts. "People don't just do things for no reason," she said quietly. Nathan tilted his head. "What do you mean?" She glanced at him, then away. "Nobody adopts a kid just because they want to. There's always a reason. Some people do it because they feel bad. Some do it to look good. Some do it because they think they have to." Her voice grew softer. "And some do it because they miss someone else." Nathan's chest tightened. She had figured it out. "I won't be him," she whispered. "No matter how hard you try." For a long moment, Nathan didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. She wasn't wrong. After his son's passing, he had buried himself in work, in charity, in anything that could distract him from the suffocating grief. And then one day, he thought, maybe if he gave another child a home, it would heal something inside him. Maybe it would make things feel normal again. But it wasn't that simple. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "You're right," he admitted. "I won't lie to you. When I first thought about adoption, I did it because I was lonely, because I missed my son." Her lips pressed into a thin line, as if she had expected that answer. "But," he continued, his voice softer, "that's not why I want to adopt you now. She frowned slightly, as if she didn't believe him. "I don't know what your life has been like," he said gently. "I don't know what you've seen, what you've been through. But I can tell you this. You deserve a home. Not because I lost someone, but because you deserve to have someone who cares about you." She looked at him for a long time, studying his face, searching for any sign of dishonesty. "I don't need a mansion," she finally said. "I don't need expensive things. I just don't want to feel like I have to be someone I'm not." Nathan nodded. "You don't," she hesitated. "And I don't want to be a replacement." "You won't be." Silence filled the room. Then, for the first time, her shoulders relaxed. Just a little. Nathan didn't push her to decide right away. Instead, he stood up. "You don't have to decide tonight," he told her. "Or tomorrow. Or even next week. But I want you to know that if you ever want a home, you have one here." She didn't say anything, but as he walked to the door, she spoke up softly. "Good night." It was a small word, a simple one, but to Nathan, it was a start. For the next few days, she stayed at the mansion, not because she had changed her mind, but because she wasn't sure where else to go. The social worker had given her space, and Nathan had kept his word. He didn't pressure her, didn't try to win her over with gifts or promises. Instead, he let her exist in the house, as if waiting for her to decide on her own terms. She wandered through the massive halls, still feeling out of place. The staff was kind, always smiling, but she noticed how they looked at her, like they weren't sure how to act around her, as if they expected her to disappear any moment. And maybe she would. Then one afternoon, she found herself outside in the garden. The air was crisp, the leaves dancing in the wind. She liked it here. It was quiet, away from the overwhelming size of the house. She sat on the wooden bench, pulling her knees to her chest, lost in thought. She didn't hear Nathan approach until he spoke. "I used to sit there with my son." She turned her head slightly, watching as he took a seat on the bench next to her, though he kept some space between them. He wasn't looking at her, just staring out at the garden. "I would tell him stories. He always liked the ones with knights and castles." He let out a small breath. "I still catch myself thinking about him every day." She studied his face, the way his jaw tensed, the way his fingers clasped together. He wasn't trying to make her feel guilty. He wasn't trying to convince her of anything. He was just telling the truth. For the first time, she saw him not as a rich man with a perfect life, but as a father who had lost someone he loved, a person who was hurting just like she was. She hesitated before speaking. "I had a friend once," she said quietly. "Her name was Mia. We were in the same foster home for a while." She picked at the sleeve of her sweater. "She told me that we'd always stick together, that no matter where we went, we'd find each other again." Nathan listened, not interrupting. "But one day a family adopted her," she continued, her voice tightening. "And she promised she'd write to me, that she wouldn't forget me." She swallowed, but she never did. Nathan was silent for a long time. "That must have hurt." She nodded, not looking at him. "I don't like trusting people," she admitted, "because they always leave." Nathan took a deep breath. "I can't promise I'll be perfect," he said, "and I can't promise that things will always be easy. But if you give me a chance, I won't leave you." She turned to face him, searching his expression. There was no pity in his eyes, no desperation, just honesty. And for the first time, something inside her shifted. That night, she lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about his words. She thought about all the times she had been let down, all the times she had hoped for something better, only to have it taken away. But this time felt different. The next morning, she found Nathan in the kitchen, drinking his coffee. He looked up, surprised to see her there so early. She took a deep breath and spoke before she could change her mind. "I think I want to stay." Nathan set his cup down carefully. "Are you sure?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah." A small relieved smile crossed his face. He didn't celebrate, didn't overwhelm her. He simply nodded. Then welcome home. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't felt before. Safe.